Hi everyone. We have a couple of items in our agenda today. Please feel free to add any other items if you have any. Um, okay, so the first one, let me share my screen as well. Okay, so the first one is actually in this PR and job integration PR. Um, we had a discussion related to bring your own workload and bring your own pod group. Um, and we have like a lot of debates, and I think uh, let's try to think about it and put the scope about about this use case so I can implement it today. Hopefully, it will be ready tomorrow. Um, so yeah, Matt.
So yeah, like personally, I'm for like keeping the PR focus on a single functionality. And for me, what we actually discussed and designed in the CAP is the functionality number one from this command, right? So basically, job controller creates workload and pod group when it's eligible for gang scheduling, when we have this like parallels more than one, etc. And I guess like we have this like kind of scope creep here when we want to try something that is very close, but is actually a different functionality, which is we create like when a user specifies their own workload and attaches to the job. In that case, the job controller will create the pod group, like manage it, and then also attach pods to this pod group. And like in general, I would be just to like introduce a single functionality in PR, right? Because we have a problem with that in open source, that PRs are huge, right? And
Yeah.
number of lines, the cost of review, it grows super linearly, right? It's not just linearly, it's super linearly, because it's really tracked to read everything, to build a mental model, to analyze, etc. And I guess even though like this functionality is very simple, like assuming we have the code that Heba added for the first functionality, because it's essentially a few lines of code in certain places, because we already have all the building blocks for like getting the workload, getting the pod group, creating the pod group, etc. I still believe like one thing is we need to document somehow this functionality somewhere, right? Basically, what are the limitations? When exactly it will work, right? So that workload needs to be created before the job. That we expect a certain structure. That it supports both gang and also basic policy, right? Things like that. Not difficult, probably like paragraph or two, but we should document it somewhere. And the other thing is like tests, which is for me the biggest problem, because even though we only have like limited number of lines of code we need to add in the production code to support that, given this is like a separate use case, I believe we need to write integration tests, and this will be actually in hundreds of lines. So I would say like, but at the same time, I understand the push to have it in this PR and to have it in 136. I would love that, because I believe we need this functionality, right? So user only operates on workload, and the pod group is automatically created by job controller. But I would say let's create a separate PR. Let's try to get it in 136. If not, like our priority is for this first functionality, right? Like, and still, like if user wants to use the bring your own workload, they can still do that, because they can create workload and pod group, right? And attach pods in pod template spec to this pod group. So that's my thinking here. Yeah, I'm like open for discussion, because obviously it's not my call here, but that's what I would do. Heba, do we have you, or I think you are frozen, at least on my screen? Is it just me, or
No, I think, yeah, we lost her.
Okay.
I don't-
Yeah. So anyone else, like, while we wait for Heva, like, any thoughts on that?
I agree in general. I wasn't looking into the specific comments, so
Yeah, I think that's a problem we have in open source, right? With two big PRs, and you will always find a reason to put more functionality into a PR because, for example, right now we have code freeze coming, and very likely if we move it to a separate PR, then the other PR will not merge. But I would say still, like, we should have some hard rules, otherwise, like, reviewing will be hard, right? We will not improve it.
May I ask just a quick question? So are there any specific like requirements we get from users?
For what exactly? Sorry, requirements?
Like to bring their own workloads to the job controller?
So I guess, like, we didn't really document that in CAP, right? The CAP was mostly focused on gang scheduling and, like, if job is eligible for gang scheduling. So we defined those criteria. Then we should create workload and pod group. I think here we kind of realized that once we have this code, it's very easy also to support. Once I have a workload, I will automatically create pod group, right? If user provided this workload. But I would say it deserves, like, to be documented somewhere. Like, for example, update the CAP.
Yeah, I agree. I also agree with this. Yeah.
Who's
I can go
next?
first? Yeah, I forgot. I was about to say. I think I did test to bring your own pod group, but I forgot. I didn't actually do it on Ebo's PR for the job controller. I did do it like once we merged the pod group V1 Alpha 2. It's not really bring your own workload anymore. It's more like bring your own pod group. Like that does work with pod specs. I actually think we may want to consider supporting it, and like just because I don't expect like the idealized world we want would be that workloads are creating the pod groups and workloads, but over like I imagine we won't get there until we have support in all of those, which might take time. So I actually think that the use case we should aim to try and support, but I think I'll have to verify for the job controller if that one would work. I tried to make sure if it would break for job set, like bring your own pod group for job set and pass that one in, but job set is built on 1.35 APIs. So I can't actually pass in the new API and verify with this feature that it didn't break anything. So I don't know yet on that one, but anyway, thanks.
Maciej?
I'll just say and support what you just said in both terms. One for let's make iterative changes to the job controller, especially with how close to the freeze we are. I there are still a couple of changes. I know I have to, and I'll be after this call ends, I'll be re-reviewing the controller bits. There's still some bits here and there within just the current scope of the PR that will probably take today and tomorrow to flush out. That leaves us with just a day for any additional functionality. So for me, it's more important to land what we committed to, and then we can discuss further. What happens with the future post 136 is up for debate, up for discussion. We can decide to keep it in alpha for the next release and iterate, expand, I don't know, do whatever we want. Or if we agree that no, there's no additional changes needed, at which point in time we can just go to beta. The beta part will be where we have to know the final shape of the functionality, because with the current implementation and with my production readiness approver hat, basically anything that goes on by default has to be production ready, basically. And the same applies for, hold on, what was the other bit that you were asking? I forgot about it.
About implementation and, like, detecting that the job is a new one. That was the.
Yeah. That's not the one. The
Okay.
annotation I commented on Slack, but just quickly noting, I'm fine with both mechanism for now. like I said, this is an alpha feature. Whether we're gonna go with annotation or alpha-enabled validation, I can live with both mechanism. What will be important is by the time we reach beta, we know the final end. And the part that I wanted to, and now I remember, at least based on my understanding, the way we wrote the cap, we were pretty explicit that only for those rare cases we will be managing the pod group and the workloads for you. In all other cases, we don't. If this is not clear in the document itself, and based on what Kevin brought up, I'm guessing that we had some maybe misunderstandings. I'm completely fine to explicitly put that in all other cases, you're basically responsible for managing the workload and the pod group on your own. We on purpose picked a very narrow use case within the job controller to verify and identify the use cases around the managing the workload. And only then, once we prove before we go to beta, we will be making decision how to move further, what kind of life cycle management. But that approach is roughly what we've been doing with all the other controllers, where we either manage or we don't. The half bake where you bring your own, but you expect us to manage it. That's a very rare case. Or I'm not sure we have anything like that. I might be wrong, but yeah. I'll shut up and I'll let others speak.
No, thank you, Mashi. That makes sense. I also believe like if we want to add this bring your own workload where job controller manages the pod group, like it deserves designing, documenting, right? Even though it might be simple, but still. And like for me, this is I agree with your interpretation of what we have in CAP, right? It was basically creating both workload and pod group in a very specific case when we say the job is for gang, actually eligible for gang scheduling. So, all right. So we don't have Heba. Not sure. We should probably someone else should present, and we should go through the next item in the agenda. Let me try.
Not sure if anyone has rights to share the screen.
I will try, but I'm not sure if I
cannot.
Zoom
so
tells
that's
me Hui Luo is the host, so he should be able to either share the host or to share the screen.
yeah.
That must be accident because I just joined to observe the meeting.
I'm
I'm not the
guessing.
host.
No, that's fine. I'm guessing that Zoom just picks the first person in the list once the original host disappears. Feel free to just add additional hosts. I don't know. That can be Matt, Dominic, Wojtek, myself, and we'll pick it up from here.
But anyway, in the agenda there are 3 items only. The second one is about PR status review, and the third one is probably interesting for the discussion. It's a DRA status in Workload API.
Yeah, I gave you a host, Matt, so you can share the screen.
Okay, can you see that's the dashboard from the document, right?
Yep.
All right, Dominic, do you want to like give a quick summary as like our main approver here?
Well, if you want, you can change the view to per PR reviews, although this is a different one that we are using.
Yeah.
And you can make it a little bit bigger.
Let me try.
So we have the topology-aware scheduling PRs, which are more or less ready to be merged. There are no remaining issues, so that includes the scheduling constraints PR. I think the other was already merged. The scoring. So yeah, basically those should be ready. We are integrating the all tasks functionality into one more PR. So this is integrate topology-aware scheduling. I don't see it here.
It might be missing the
should
workload.
be P0, right?
Yeah. Let me.
Okay, so maybe let's just summarize. So another thing is workload-aware preemption. So there is the review is ongoing, and other stuff. We have a few DRA changes. So the DRA resource claim support for workloads. This is pretty interesting, and I guess that the second point is about that. There is one fix to the problem of gang scheduling in the array. So currently, the second pod in a gang cannot be scheduled before the first pod gets into API, gets reserved in the resource claim in API server. So the PR16 is about to fix that issue. The resource claim support in workloads, basically the issue there is when to deregister pod group from resource claim. That's something that it's still open. What else do we have here?
I think what is happening with that, last I saw on Friday or Saturday, was deregistration would happen only in the resource claim controller. We don't do it in the scheduler.
Okay, so we can leave the resource claim with pod group, and pod group will be
when pod group is deleted, then we deregister it.
So this is something that we also wanted to suggest. So the question is whether it will be unregistered when the pod group is removed, or do you think it should be removed earlier?
Yeah, we should not infer from the pods when we should deallocate when we should unreserve it, because the whole point is that we get an explicit signal from the controller that the pod group's no longer needed, and that's the only time that we go delete it.
So the signal is basically deletion of pod group, or okay?
I think it's deletion. Well, I mean, it gets marked, right? It gets marked for deletion or whatever. I don't know exactly, John. I saw it. Probably can be more accurate.
Yeah. So the exact behavior right now is that so the resource claim controller will never explicitly delete the resource claim if it's allocated for a pod group. All it will do is remove the pod group from the reserved for list in the resource claim. And then we'll let the garbage controller or the garbage collector. So the resource claim will have an owner reference to the pod group. So then when you delete the pod group, then the resource claim will also be deleted as long as the reserved for list is empty, which is the same as how existing resource claims work.
Okay, so basically we're saying, like, for now, where we are not dealing with like suspended jobs or anything like that, we'll have like this simple integration in job controller we are creating, although we don't have a way to attach resource claim. But anyway, let's assume we have. So we are creating a job creates pod group. Let's say it has like resource claim. And then once we delete the job, the GC will try to delete the pod group, right?
Correct. Yep.
And then the resource claim controller will like react to that, right? And remove the reserve for entry, right, for this pod
Yep.
group.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, like the one thing that we need to discuss is like the future risk, for example, the suspended jobs, right? Like what to do there. But okay, we have still.
Yeah, I don't even know what the right semantics are there. Like, do we release the claim or don't we in a suspended job? Like, if we release it, somebody else might take it. I don't know. Like, is that
Yeah,
something-
do we even like delete the pod group, or like do we keep it? Like, I think this is a whole topic on its own. So
yeah,
That makes sense. Yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
perfect.
and I think right now they're left around in the job controller. So that's what I verified that. But I think we called that out. That if you suspend, I mean, if you suspend and resume, it does delete the pods. I think eventually we probably do want to remove that pod group if we want the resource claims to not be. If you want each new instantiation of a group of pods to point to a different resource claim, I think we would have to clean that one up.
Yeah, I
But,
would also. Yeah.
Go on, Andre.
Sorry for to jump in the game. I think I agree here. For me, like suspend is mostly like, I can tolerate all of the deletion, the pod groups, the resource claims, etc. And when the job is, unsuspended, we want to kind of recreate those resources, because I know there is ongoing proposals from Kevin specifically to mutate, for example, some of the pod specs when the job is suspended, which will be essential for like variety of use cases we've been discussing with across, train job set, etc. So for me, having a way to delete the resource claim and pod group it's a good thing overall.
Okay, or like, do you or anyone else like see a use case where we would want not to delete and like to keep the claim? Do we have a scenario like that where basically we want to suspend, but we want to keep
I feel
the?
like that's like a different. If we did, it would be like that's more like reservation stuff we've talked about in the past, and I would prefer we handle it with some other
API or like way, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It seems like making it implicit there is probably not the right way to do it.
Yeah, I think in Q, right, we did have some of this conversation around pod readiness check and job readiness check, probably something like this, when we reserve the capacity before it can be scheduled. But yeah, I think it can be talked separately, right?
Yeah, like there's another. This isn't really a 136 thing, but like there's a whole discussion. There's a use case in when we're looking at like even native resources, meaning like CPU memory, where there are use cases where even on the same node, you want to set aside a set of CPUs or something, and then schedule pods against that set aside set of CPUs. And I've got a comment somewhere on one of the issues about maybe the right way to do that is with pod groups and things like that. But that's like, it requires design, it requires thought, it might be wrong, right? Like it's way too far out there.
Yeah, I was thinking also about that, but if we have, I think, resource shared by many pods, in that case, we could do it in a pod group.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean.
So for suspended jobs and pod groups I think we call out in the job controller, the beta promotion, that like we would want to clean up pod groups upon suspend. I guess what I'm wondering is, this sounds like it's going to be a requirement for any controller that is managing pod groups. We should treat pod groups like we do pods, and that they're ephemeral and should be recreated if new groups are created. So is that like kind of our stance going forward?
I think that makes sense to me. But
okay, and that makes sense to me. I think for a job we we definitely don't have that right now, which is fine for alpha. I think we call it out for beta that like the suspend resume work needs to be fleshed out a little bit more for beta, which is fine. But I guess I just want to make sure if I'm reviewing other controllers that's something. Yeah, we need to make sure it's there.
It also makes sense to me because, like, conceptually, pod group is this runtime grouping of pods, right? If there are no pods to group, then like it doesn't really make sense to have a pod group, right? At least for now, until we maybe we'll change that in the future, but we need like a concrete like user stories here, user scenarios that we want to support. So
yeah, I think right now the trickiest case is where you have ephemeral groups of pods, but you want to like keep that same exact allocation. Like if you scale a pod group to 0 for a long period of time and you want other things to be able to share something, but then yeah, I think as long as we keep the pod group to be ephemeral, then I think this will work.
Sorry, I think ephemeral, but like again, we shouldn't be the controller needs to explicitly delete the pod group. Like even if there's no pods, the pod group can stick around, and the resources that are associated with that pod group should still stick around as long as the pod group does. And that way, it's up to the controller whether they reserve and hold on to some resource when they're scaled to 0 or whatever.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. In particular, removing would be important to let scheduler pick a different topology option next time it schedules pod group.
Yeah.
That applies to resource claims as well. If we implement task over resource claim, that would be the same problem. And at some point, we probably will have to create pod group binding like a mechanism, extension point. So for now, we register pod group when the first pod is registered, but at some point we will probably have to create a concept of pod group binding. So whenever a pod group is scheduled, then it is bound.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? That like pod group, once it gets scheduled, it actually like it manifests some particular placement, right? In case of topology or like we can think similarly about the array. So I think it makes sense, but yeah, again, like we should design.
So in particular, we can have several pod groups registered to a single resource claim. Theoretically, it's also possible. So the pod groups would behave like pods currently. I think that was also discussed some time ago.
It's possible. API. I don't think unless we do the tasks like zonal type. Like I don't have a resource. Like I have compute domains and TPU slices, which would be shared would be used by a single pod group. I don't today have a use case where pod group needs multiple needs a resource claim needs multiple pod groups unless we were to use it as a higher level constraint, but we didn't implement that this cycle. But like you could use it for that. You could say like, oh, here's a zone represented by this, and you have as many pod groups as you want attached to that using like multiple allocations or something. But I don't think we have a strong use case for that at this point.
Yeah, that's why I'm saying that it is theoretical situation.
Yeah, but then the question is, because it overlaps with hierarchy, right? As John mentioned, and we are going to introduce another level because we see. Oh, sorry. We see like a need from that. Like, oh, Dominic, like, is it me or like is it something wrong with your connection?
Higher level, like grouping, registering pod groups, and
it's
not. It's Dominic.
Okay. Dominic, we lost you for a second, or not sure if you are now.
Yeah, don't worry. Probably my connection was bad.
Okay. I'm just saying, like, we need to be clear here, like, because we will introduce another level of hierarchies, right? With pod put subgroup or something. Maybe the name is not the best name. Maybe we figure out something better. But definitely we see a need for like new, like more levels, right? In use cases like disaggregated inference, or even like gang of gangs with job set, for example, right? So a question there. I think also like topology or DRA might also get tricky there. Like we haven't thought it through, right? Maybe that's a better word. So we need to think it more carefully. And if we are considering having also some kind of like logical grouping with resource claims sharing multiple pod groups, then we should just make sure we have like thought it through properly. So yeah.
Are we? I don't know where those docs are for the pod. I know I've seen the pod subgroup. It wasn't clear to me, like if we are saying that there will be a separate like API and controller for pod subgroups, like there is for pod group or workload, or would it just be like fields in the pod group API?
But we do not have a control. Like, what do we mean by controller for pod
I just
group?
mean like a separate API. Like, would we say like pod group can has a reference to a pod subgroup, and then like we would have that object be different?
This is TBD, right? We all see the need for another level of hierarchy, but we haven't agreed yet on like how to do that in the runtime layer, like in the runtime, yeah. Because like in workload,
another top level object probably is not worth it unless the semantics are really different. But yeah, I can understand the concern.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I guess. Well, we'll see what it says. What you all come up with. Yeah, I would definitely like to get the API, or at least, yeah, I don't know if the top level one I like, but I guess if the doc comes out, or design comes out, we can iterate on that one. I'm assuming it's not up anywhere, right? Like I know I've seen some discussion of it, but I imagine that's like a 1.37 problem.
So I like Antoni, who is I think on the call, is working, like will be working on gathering design requirements for integrating with LWS, for example, this disaggregated inference, where we need this another level. Similarly, job set, right? So like he will be reaching out to you soon if you haven't already. And I hope out of this research we'll see like a concrete use cases that we need to support and a need for this another level. So probably the next step will be to start the design and the cap for that.
I would hope. Do you think Matt will have enough material to discuss it a week from today?
Probably not. Antoni, are you on the call? I think I saw you somewhere.
Yeah, I am. Yeah. I haven't reached.
We're all in, when many of us are in Amsterdam for that thing.
So I haven't reached out to Kevin just yet, but I've got a call scheduled related to LWS and disaggregated serving for Thursday with Roman and Edwin. So yeah, so far I was just laser focused on making sure we de-risk the delivery of stuff that we planned for 156.
But it will be definitely an important topic.
Yep.
I guess we can still discuss that, right? Even if we don't have full data, we more or less know where this research is going, right? So.
Yep.
Oh, Heba, welcome back, right? You are muted, so.
Yeah, Zoom decided to stop working on all my machines. So thanks to Maciek, he already summarized whatever like you discussed while I'm was away. I have just one more question related to the job integration. Should I remove the indexer for now, or should I keep it? Because we have another debate related to that. I already implemented it in a separate commit. Should I keep it or should I remove it?
So I think there are two indexers that we were talking about. Like
Yes.
one is in the controller and one is in the admission. And I think
one in the controller. Yeah, the controller.
The one in the controller, given we already have it, like let's leave it. We will need it anyway. Like it will be needed for performance. So given we already have it, like let's have it.
Okay, perfect. Another thing for the status, PR, we had a discussion related to should we keep the schedule true or not, the condition for the schedule true or not, if like after the main count reached, we got a couple of pods and like something happened and we couldn't find place for these pods, but we already like for the pod group we reached the main count. We were discussing to add a condition that if like if we already had this schedule true, we should keep it as true as long as we reach the main count. But after like a second thought, should we change the reason? If we change the reason, it will be really misleading. What should we do? Like it's a little bit not clear for the user if we kept
So
it.
I think we agreed on the PR, right, with Wojtek, Maciek, what to do now. We acknowledge it's not ideal, but it's only like alpha, so
Okay.
we should add it as a beta graduation criteria to basically improve on that.
So so for now it would be just keeping it true.
So logic should be, if pod group was scheduled, it should never go back to like unscheduled or like whatever. Like there's
regardless, even
Yeah,
if the main count went down. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So basically, like what you propose, right? Checking the condition, and if it's already set to schedule, then basically we'll leave it as that. And,
Okay.
Andre, did we cover your topic? It seemed like maybe we did.
Yeah, so I think we have time. We can quickly talk about it. Do we have any other topics? All right. Yeah, so I just want to follow up on the DRA support with the Workload API. I know we have a merge cap. I think it's the cap number is 5736, right? PR is like 5729. So looking at the proposal, we're going to. So first, let me ask you the question: like, will this be part of 1.36?
We hope so. Dominic's looking at it. This is the one we were talking about a little bit earlier as far as how the resource claim gets cleaned up.
Okay.
It's pod group only, not workload, right? It's at the pod group level. We don't have a use case particularly for the workload level, so we just like punt it on that if we even ever need it. But it's per pod group we do resource claims.
So for 1.36, we want to do per pod group resource claim template reference, right?
Yes, and yes, I this is actually something that's really important to me. We are working on building some things internally on top of this, as well as there's a discussion. I think you may have been in there on the compute domain stuff. Yeah, from the train job, right? We were talking about.
Yep.
So actually, I'm hoping. So Kevin and I are supposed to do a demo of some of this stuff, workload API with compute domain on GB200 on GKE in a week. And so I'm hoping to actually use the 136 and build this in and actually show that life cycling.
Yeah, I think because what I'm trying to understand, and we also chat a little bit
about
about
Kevin, other Kevin. Sorry, Kevin Harris.
Oh, no, I know.
Yeah.
Whenever Kevin DRA, it's not me. I know.
Yeah.
Sorry, Andre.
So because what I'm trying to understand also, we discussed with Ron a little bit, it's like it does have a reference to the resource claim template name right now, which means it looks like workload owners should bring their own resource claim template, which means like do we see this orchestration will go to the workload owner controllers, which means like it won't be part of the workload API by itself, right?
Like to me, that's just like you bring a job template or you bring a pod template, right? You bring a resource claim template, and that pod template. Well, I guess you have to bring in your pod group template as well. So I guess I see your point. Like this gets back to the bring your own, and when how you create the pod group template that contains the reference to that resource claim.
And the pod group template right now part of Workload API.
My expectation was, that this would be with bring your own workload. That would define those resource claim templates. And I think Matt has a document describing how that layering, right, and defaulting is going to work. But I don't think we'll have that in 136, will we? No. Yeah.
No, we don't yet even have an agreement on that. Like that's one of the things that we want to discuss like in a week.
So is the concern here that like we have a duplication of resource like scheduling, like in the pod template, we also have resource claim templates, and then we have
those
pod groups that are also referencing this. So it seems like we have two different ways of requesting.
They're two different semantics. No, those have two different semantics. One has lifecycle. The pod group one's lifecycle with the pod group. The pod one's lifecycle with the pod. You can optionally reference the pod group one from the pod in order to create a shared one, but you actually don't need to. Like with compute domain, I don't think I need to do that. I was just asking John about this. Like, I think it'll work. We'll find out. I think I can just have an independent compute domain generated by a resource claim that's lifecycled with the pod group. And I don't actually need to directly reference it in the pod because that's not how compute domain works. For TPU slicing thing we're thinking about, we're planning on doing shared, although maybe we don't need to. Maybe we can do something like compute domain's doing. I have to think more about it. But those are different things, right? The reference from the pod to the resource claim created and lifecycle with the pod group, that implements the sharing, which would, for example, use it for tasks to constrain. Like if we wanted to do that, would constrain it. If we don't care about the constraint, we don't need that connection. And so we can just use the label-based task to do the task part. We can use the DRA-based resource pod group resource claim to do the provisioning part and the configuration part of that object, that logical device. And they're distinct. I mean, you have to make sure those two pieces line up properly. That's all. The problem is that Andre's raising is that right now, as far as I can tell, we don't have a way for the user to customize without the bring your own workload. We don't have the way for the user to customize the pod group template and therefore attach a resource claim template to it.
Yeah, and resource claim template as well, right? Because resource claim template should be pre-created before you create the Workload API, from my understanding.
Yes.
Looking at this API, right?
Yes. You create the resource claim template, you create the workload that references the pod group template, and then that gets picked, that pod group template gets picked up by the job or whatever controller.
Yeah, because if we compare to pod group template, there is no such, API as pod group template for us, right? You just extract, right? Within the Workload API.
Right.
Yeah.
And here in this doc, right, resource claims are one of the things that can be included in the workload config of the. Well, go ahead, Matt. You describe
it.
Yeah. So basically, I think currently you can still use this API. Like assuming we merge the PR, but we all hope for that. But basically, you need to create workload and pod group on your own, right? And set the resource claim template name. So as Andre, you said, you need to first create the resource claim template, add it to the workload, add it to the pod group, and then you can attach, like in the pod template spec, right, in the job API integration, basically the scheduling group that is pointing to this pod group, and it will work, right? And that's the thing. But in the future, like once we will have this, let's call it controller API, right? So basically, you will be able to express the scheduling intent on the controller API, right? And there in this document that we were discussing like a week or two ago, basically we have a way to do that like on the fly, right? Without bringing your own workload. But basically this will be automatically created by controllers, right? And just to make clear, like right now, if you want to use this feature, you need to create both workload and pod group, because as we discussed, like the first item today on the agenda, we will have this bring your own workload where job automatically creates the pod group, but in a separate PR. So likely it will not manage to submit in 136, but we'll see. Does it?
I'm
does it
just
make sense?
yeah. I'm just like trying to like just to answer this question. Like, do we really need to have a resource claim template as an object, like moving forward?
Yeah, we do.
Because like, well, we can deprecate it and remove it. Because if everything will go to workload API, there is no such need for workload template or resource claim template, right?
I don't know.
Controllers need to create it.
Yeah, but
separately.
yeah.
So the resource claim template can contain all kinds of stuff that the user can customize, and we don't want to embed all kinds of stuff in the controller APIs. In order for the controller to create this object, it would need. So the resource claim template is used by the resource claim controller to punch out resource claims for according to the pod group lifecycle. That can have configuration options. It can have multiple requests. It can be arbitrarily complex. And so if maybe I'm not understanding the question, but like, I don't see how we would get around. We just have a reference to it that's all that goes into the workload controller is a reference to it.
Yeah, I think what I want to say, like in the workload API, right? Today we do have pod group template as the substruct, right? It's not a separate API. Like similar to this, in the workload API, if we don't want to have a reference but directly embed the spec, right, in the workload API, we don't really need to have a separate resource claim template as well.
You're right. Like the resource claim template exists because when we were building DRA pod v1, we didn't want to take the fields and embed them in a template like we do with like pod template because it's too much change in a v1 API.
We didn't have a workload back then, right? Workload API at all.
So in theory, you could embed it in there. I don't know. I would leave that up to the API reviewers. Like we already have the resource claim template object, so it seems like probably that's extra work if we can just do a reference. I mean, it means you need a separate object, but like, yeah, presumably, I mean, there's probably config maps and other things that go along with your workload too that are, I don't know.
Yeah, there's like UX improvement, right? So technically, something we could consider when we'll be introducing this was API from controllers, but yeah.
So sort of, John, I see also heads up. Like my point is here, like, because if we don't really discuss this before going to beta, like the problem might be how we're going to introduce this API to, job set, train job, etc., right? Because like for now, which is unclear for me, how those controllers will bring resource claim template to the workload object, right? And how we'll expose this API to the end user specifically. Like, because for example, like for us, like on the training side, like we don't really want to expose a lot of complexity of DRA to the end user. We just want to make sure, as I mentioned in the issue, that the user who write PyTorch, it's appropriately be scheduled to the like on the multi-node NVLink domain, right? We don't really need to explain user how to do it. And the question would be how the API might look like from the controller perspective if we support this.
Yeah, one of the things we've talked about, this is a great topic. I think you're right. We should have a bigger, fuller conversation about this. But like there's a few ideas. One we talked about somewhere I talked about in some document of like sort of syntactical sugar that you can like make the YAML look a certain way, but have some implicit resource claims in the background. Another would be cluster scoped resource claim templates, like device classes, right? It's just a name and the user doesn't have to know about any of the complexity. You could have a set of sort of predefined resource claim templates that could be referenced by name, and then but they're not namespace scoped, they're cluster scoped, and then they get punched out as resource claims in a namespace. Like those are all options, but we haven't figured it out. So yeah, your requirements would be useful there.
Kevin or
I think John is next.
All right, yeah.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to offer a disclaimer to anybody looking at the KEP that the implementation has changed a little bit from the KEP. A lot of the high level stuff is the same. Like the pod API in particular, like there's no new pod API in the actual implementation. So that's just one thing to look out for. But I'll try to update that KEP as soon as like code read is over.
Yeah, that came out of API review.
So what's going on in my head now with Q is like, so we're working on DRA and Q, and like basically pods have this resource claim template, and then we fetch the resource claim and check to see how many requests are going to a device class. And if we start having sharing of quota, what I'm wondering is, do all the individual pods in a pod group reference the same? Would it be a resource claim or a resource claim template that's the same for every pod?
So so in the cap, you'll see this is exactly what John was just talking about. In the cap, there's a separate stanza for pod group claims. Those mean that the pods share that, so the resource gets allocated once for the pod group, and then the pods share them. So Q shouldn't really care, right? It should just count it as the once. In the slightly different API, the same semantics apply, but there's just different logic for how to determine that. So anything that's, I guess the way I would put it from a Q perspective, as I understand it, the resources get out, any pod group level resources should be counted once for the pod group, and that's it. I don't think we need to quota references to it, which is what the pod association with it is. But in the pod group, if you list a pod group, if you list a resource claim template in the pod specification that isn't for a pod group resource claim template, then it's per pod. So you're going to have, basically, we had it in two separate things, which would have maybe made it easier for you to differentiate between the two, but through API review, it's been collapsed into the existing API. And you have to look at the pod group. If there's a name like that in the pod group, then that's the one you use.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was clear at all.
So to play back what you're saying, I think is that pod specs would need to reference a resource claim if they're being shared among a bunch of different pods, and the pod group would have a resource claim template, but they would all point to the same resource claim that template instantiated.
Yeah, any pod group level resource claim template needs to be, so Q is going to have to understand pod groups, right? And it's going to have to understand that there are resources at the pod group level, and that even if it's saying there's 1,000 pods going to be created, it's one pod group, and therefore those resources are quoted once.
Yeah, I guess I wasn't thinking of that at the time when we were talking about this, but I mean, we'll be changing Q probably for a lot of this anyway. Obviously, right now in Q, we are not referencing the pod spec to go to the pod group to get information about quota. We would be looking at the pod spec and then surmising from that. But I mean, if it's on the pod spec, we could probably add that. I just didn't think that would be something we had to do for Q until
what
now.
What are you doing in general with shared claims? Are you're just not supporting them?
I think we don't even allow you to specify a resource claim for Q at the moment.
Right. So everything's pod level, and so there's going to have to be some work done to get.
I'll have to check on that one. I mean, I think we were looking at resource claim templates because the problem was, I think we just ignore it for resource claims because we have no way of tallying. Like our quota was how many individual requests you're hitting the device class, and for a resource claim, if you're specifying just a fixed resource claim, it's really just like one. But
yeah, the first pod creates it, and then from then on it's zero, right?
Yeah, but then I guess for quota, it seems like to me the quota should be limited at the DRA level. Like how many pods can reference that same resource claim should be a parameter of the resource slice. Or sorry, I don't know the terms, but
yeah, no, you're right. It's just not right. I think it's right. Like it's a missing feature. There's no regulation of sharing between pods. Like in the very earliest DRAs that never went to beta, even you had to explicitly say a claim was shareable. Maybe we should have kept that. At some point we decided it wasn't necessary, but maybe that was a mistake. Things might be simpler if we had required that.
Anyway, it's in my head now. I'll try to remember that for Q going forward. But yeah, I mean, obviously for DRA and Q right now, we're going to go with what's in the pod spec. I'll follow up with some people on the resource claims.
Okay.
Like what we're doing there separately from this. But yeah, all right. Thanks, everyone.
I mean, most critical would be what you're already doing, like getting the pod resource claim template pod support, and that's most matches with Q's way it works. So.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to say, so Andre, like if you haven't already, please take a look at this document when we are proposing the API for like all
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
features, like in particular resource claims, and like any feedback from like the perspective of train job, like other controllers you work on that would
Yeah.
be very
So
helpful.
we'll cover the resource claims there, right, in this doc, just to give you a chance to go deeply to review like the latest changes, right?
So here's like an example, probably a better example, as John pointed out, like it shouldn't be GPU, but more of a domain here at the pod group level. But basically, in case of, let me make it bigger, LWS, right? That's what API gives you. Like it allows you to define those constraints, like topology or resource claims at different levels, like global for the whole LWS, or so all the replicas, or like a single replica for the leader worker set, right? So
yeah, I mean, we definitely can follow up this in the doc, because the problem with this approach, again, the workload owners will be responsible to bring their own, RCT or resource claim templates, right? Which is a real problem, like for the many workload owners. But we can talk about it offline. Like I don't.
Yeah,
I
I
guess
think a cluster scope one could be interesting, because then then the administrator creates this like palette of things for them to use. Yeah.
I maybe just want to ask a question before we drop. Like, so the reason behind having the slice in the resource claim, sorry, like in resource claim template. So in the resource claims, we have a slice there because we want to have a way to, for the single pod group, to be able to attach to multiple resource claims. Like, do we see this use case also being emerged in the future? So when a one pod group might have multiple resource claims.
I don't have like. I don't have a specific. I don't think I have a specific. I don't know if the disaggregated. Like I don't know yet. I would say it's not clear, but this is basically analogous to pods, and so it's like we're keeping the same form for how we do with pods. And pods, we definitely use that quite a bit with.
Because I think we should talk about it more. Because again, like if we go to the pod subgroup idea, right? We can think about the resource claim scheduling, right, part. So it's going to the subgroups, etc. Because things can become very complicated when you have a slice within a single pod group, how you're going to group them, etc. So I'm not really sure if we have a simple way to support such thing, right? The grouping part. Okay.
Okay, yeah, let's definitely like open all that up in the 137 timeframe. This is an alpha, so we can, yeah.
All right, so I guess we are out of time. So thanks everyone, and see you on the summit, right, next week. Yeah. Cool. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.